Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 197. And we're going to compare the Korean society or the country of Korea with the country of Haiti and try to look at why the two countries are so different from each other. So it's sort of a continuation of yesterday's discussion of Haiti and just a lot of the acculturation issues of Haitians who come to America, at least in the way that it's happening now. And so I mentioned yesterday that once they achieved their independence, they killed probably most of the French, maybe not every single one of them, but pretty much all of them. But there was no freedom in the society. So whoever came to power once the revolution was over, they instituted a very authoritarian regime. And one might wonder what was the culture of the now liberated slaves. And one might argue that perhaps some of the cultural values or the way that they saw the world influenced them and did not allow them to be able to practice freedom and therefore sort of rise up out of that very poor situation. But realistically, other countries came in, established puppet governments, and prevented any hope of having a free society. And so, without hope for improvement, things would spiral downward. You have negative cultural practices developing, unproductive practices developing simply for survival. And so you begin to hear the stories of that barbecue guy who in gang leader in Haiti who apparently is cannibalistic. And if you ever watch a documentary on Haiti, the level of violence is just insane. I know of some people, I taught students down at the university who escaped from Haiti, and they would tell stories, share stories of their family, which are pretty much unimaginable here in the United States. The level of prostitution, selling children into prostitution is commonplace. I had two Haitian students once in the same semester. I had two Haitian students, and I found out they were Haitian because I would ask questions. Oh, where are you from? Whatever. Try to get to know students who were either vocal or came to class early. I would sort of kill some time by, having casual conversations. And so I found out in two different sections in the same semester, I had two Haitians. And so initially I was like, oh, wow, you both are Haitians. In my head. I was thinking, wow, they're both from Haiti. But one student, female student, she was always dressed very, very well in what I guess is sort of Haitian style clothing. I never saw her wear the same outfit twice. And then I had another student who always wore the same clothes every single day, right? Through the whole semester, he wore the same things. And I had lunch with him once and I tried to find out more about his background. And of course, you probably can guess the two students, their family experiences were completely different on the opposite ends of the scale, the political spectrum. The nicely dressed student was part of the political class. And so when we talked about Papa Doc and Baby Doc, the more recent sort of uh, uh, authoritarian regime that ended in the 80s, their family was connected. Her family was connected with that regime. And so they were able to enjoy a very, very high standard of living. And so she would go on and on about how great it was and how Baby Doc should be brought back, get rid of all this communist stuff that's going on with Aristide at the time. And so that was her position. And so she was like, if things used to be great and now we have all of this trouble. When I talked to the other student, the student who always wore the same outfit every day, he basically said life was miserable and they barely escaped from Haiti. And now coming to, the big city in America, his parents would always tell him to be careful of who he associates with. He's different from everybody in that country, and that he has to work really hard. And so, even life in America was very, very difficult. It was just that he had more options. He could go to school, he can get educated. But when he described life in Haiti, miserable, absolutely like a living hell. We did some readings in class about Haiti, and I asked him if he was familiar with any of the kind of phenomena that was going on. And he said, "Yeah, yeah, that's pretty much commonplace." And so you see the two completely different experiences of life in Haiti. And this is characteristic of a country which has a very authoritarian regime, which profits and plunders from the people. And a lot of their wealth comes from subsidies from the United States. So, foreign aid, which is given to a country that is a vassal state of the United States, most of the government will take most of the money, and then whatever's left over will, well, it doesn't make it to the people. And so that's why they live in such horrible conditions. So the United States basically props up authoritarian regimes in places like Haiti. It happens all over Africa as well. And so it's not because it's a racial thing or something about Black or African culture, which keeps them impoverished, but it's more about who's controlling the government, what are their incentives. Now you contrast this, right? So again, final statement. So even though Haiti became the second republic in this hemisphere, it still remains one of the poorest, if not the poorest, country on this in this hemisphere. So contrast that with Korea, South Korea. Okay, so there's North Korea, South Korea, a division which happened after World War II. But prior to the annexation, the end of World War II, it was just Korea, right? So in 1945, all of a sudden, you have North and South Korea, whereas before that, it was just simply Korea. Okay. Uh, but in 1950, and for 3 years, you had the Korean War. And during the Korean War, it was pretty violent. There was a lot of bombing. And so pretty much the country was flattened, right? The cities were flattened. Everything was bombed out. It's 70% mountains. So take that with a grain of salt. But all of the living areas, the cities, the infrastructure, it was bombed out. Okay. And so you go from a completely war torn country to becoming a technological marvel today. And Korean cars, the Hyundai cars, they started being sold in America in the late 80s and early 90s. And I don't know if anyone remembers, but it used to be a buy one, get one free kind of thing, right? I remember some of the commercials where one person would try to drive two cars home, try get one car, drive it at 20 yards, and then jump into the other car and drive it 20 yards, to try to get it home. So you have this kind of situation where a country that was completely bombed out, impoverished, yet becomes a manufacturing marvel by the time you get to the late 80s. And so that would be 30 years later. 30 years, you go from a lot of poverty to competing with the United States with certain products. And then fast forward to today, right, to 2020s, most of the electronic or a lot of the electronic equipment that we use is from Korea, stamped Samsung, right? Or Lotte or Lucky, Gold Star. At least I used to see those brands, not so much now, but there are a lot of Korean car companies here, Hyundai, Kia, right? These kinds of cars. So of course, I mentioned before the cost of acculturation of Koreans living in America. So when I was growing up, it was much more convenient. Like It was a lot easier to ditch a lot of the Korean cultural values, traditions, the language, because there was no value. There was no real value in the face of Western society, right? Everything seemed better in the West. And so why would you pay the cost of time and effort to learn all of these traditions when it was so much better in America? And so, culture, in terms of cultural capital, that is the value of certain cultural practices worth to maintain, there wasn't a whole lot. And then all of a sudden, there was this revolution. People started watching Korean dramas. People started listening to K-pop, and this happened in the 90s and uh, in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I was like, what is this? And I never really listened to any of it. I never really I still don't actually, even though when I was still at the university, they asked me to be the K-pop faculty advisor. I said, sure, why not? But I still didn't listen to K-pop. I wasn't interested in it at all. And I was so surprised to see so many of my students just be so crazy about all things Korean food, Korean whatever. And they told me they had plans to study abroad in Korea. They spoke Korean, right? Better than I could speak Korean. And you started to see a lot of younger Koreans, instead of rejecting the Korean language and Korean culture, you saw this sort of nouveau kind of neo uh, awakening among Korean cultural awareness among younger people. It was pretty amazing. And I saw that that was possible primarily because, uh, you know, Korea itself became a lot wealthier, right? So, how did it happen? How was it that a country that was bombed out all of a sudden become wealthy? Like, why couldn't Haiti do that? But Korea was able to do that, right? So, obviously, this is not a complete overview of life in Korea, but a couple of things to consider. Number one, Korea is not close to the United States as Haiti is. And so, therefore, it's a little bit more difficult to exert political, governmental control over Korea. Plus, culturally speaking, Koreans are a lot different. Their history goes back at least 2,000 years. Even my family name, the first king to have that family name lived 2,000 years ago, and everyone kind of knew who he was. You can still see his tomb over there in Korea. But when the Korean War was over, the government that was instituted, which arguably was a puppet government, right? My dad, he told me experiences of where, after he came to America, there was a coup d'état. Park Chung-Hee took over the country from Syngman Rhee, Lee Seung-man, and then basically he was called down to Washington D.C. and he was grilled for many hours to try to figure out, because he came out of nowhere, and so the State Department was asking him, because he met with Eisenhower once upon a time, and so he was sort of on the radar of the State Department. And so when the coup d'état took place, he took a trip down. They asked him to come down to D.C. He had a long, long discussion with them. And so that's when my dad realized that the Korean government in Korea in the 70s, even in the early 70s, could not exist without permission from the United States, right? That's what he sort of figured out. But in spite of that influence and that control, they still had a large measure of independence, right? And they instituted sort of this protectionist economic system. But the protectionism was not the kind of protectionism that you see here in the United States, where companies are allowed to become lazy. The protection was against foreign competition to foster and nurture Korean businesses to mature to better compete with foreign companies. So import goods were extremely expensive. Even when I was there in the 90s, six Oreo cookies was $5, right? So it was import goods were really, really expensive. And this was to allow the domestic industries to develop, have all the capital investment and get to the point where they can compete with other countries. And so what they would do is they would develop factories and industries to match the level and quality of Western countries. And they did that for a while. It's also worthy to note that the United States had a heavy military presence in Korea for a very long time, which meant that Korea itself did not have to spend as much money on defense, just like NATO, what it does for Europe. All those countries could take the money that they otherwise would have spent on the military and focused it and poured it into their economy. So you had that kind of investment in the domestic industry. Early on, Park Chung-Hee, the guy who had the coup, who started the coup or had the coup, led the coup, he had the 5-year plans that he would sort of give to the country. He said, in 5 years, these are the goals that we have for the country, which is very communistic in that sense, very fascistic. However, because they had the model of capitalism here in the West, they tried to follow that system, except with protectionism and also government subsidies, all of this kind of stuff. They called it Maul Undong, which basically means the New Village movement. But they kept doing it. And so what you begin to see in the Korean economy is a very twisted economy where 60%, like this was maybe 5, 10 years ago, I read that 60% of South Korea's economy was Samsung. Right? One company was basically 60% of that entire country's economy. And they had these several companies, which are called Jebol. And what they are conglomerate companies heavily subsidized and protected by the government, where they get all of the favored contracts, favored regulations so that they can grow and compete. And each of these conglomerates made everything from cars and electronic goods to ships, like, ocean going cargo, uh, carrying super ships, right? I mean, they at the time they were growing in their ranking in terms of how many ships they would make and what ranking they had when it came to shipbuilding, globally speaking. So you would have all of this stuff going on. It was pretty amazing on that level, on that industrial level. But at the same time, because of course it's a government protectionist program, other aspects of society suffered greatly. For example, farmers. There was no capital investment in farm equipment. And so when I was there in the 90s, there were no lawnmowers. And the reason why there were no lawnmowers is because you would put all those old ladies who still used a sickle, right, hand cutting the grass. And so you had gangs of women, like rows and rows of women cutting grass by hand in all the parks and all of these tourist spots, right? So no lawnmowers, no gas powered engines, not even walking mowers, but basically 20, 30 women in a line, slowly going across the lawn and cutting the grass by hand. And so that's where you began to see, oh, okay, now you can see that the capital investment happened in certain industries, and in the other industries, they're still doing it the way they did it 100 years ago. Even growing rice, which is a very, as a staple over there in Korea, they would have lattice farming, and, it was pretty cool to see, but no machines. And so everything was still done by hand. And so you begin to see this uber wealthy class, right? This class of people that had so much money, that were spending thousands of dollars every day just buying coffee. And then on the other hand, you see people who are really struggling to make a living, right? Especially cabbage farmers. I remember there was one time when I was in Korea, you had a group of people, young people, children of these extremely wealthy people, just blowing their money in nightclubs. And then on the other hand, you see news stories of cabbage farmers that can't make it, can't sell their cabbage on the open market because it's just not worth it. And so they just, don't even harvest it. They just turn over the ground on top of the cabbage they had just grown. Right. And so you see that stark contrast there. And that's the problem of having a government controlled economy in that way. So you have extremely wealthy people on one end and then people who are actually suffering on the other. But the country has a long history, like I said, at least 2,000 years. And over those 2,000 years, you have a lot of conformity, you have a lot of submission, particularly because of the Confucian mindset that's there. And so it is very much unlike America. It is very much unlike Haiti. So it was bombed out, yeah, sure, but it had a long history before that. And that's what it would fall back to. And so when the coup d'etat happened and the president said, we as a nation, we are going to do this, pretty much nearly everybody, like 90% of the population said, yeah, that's what we got to do to compete with the rest of the world. And so they sort of, on one level, accepted the fact that they were going to have a kind of a corrupt system. So, as George Gammon always says, that there's going to be a lot of trade offs. And part of the trade off we're witnessing now. So they protected their economy, the culture for such a long time that once they start allowing all of the other foreign influences in their country, it's almost like a whiplash, right? And so you have this extreme reaction of adoption, of selling out all of their own traditional cultural values and adopting Western ones, right? So it's a sudden influx of cultural ideas. And so they abandon everything that is Korean for what is Western, hence Korean dramas, Korean K-pop, right? It's an embracing, a subtle change, but otherwise embracing wholly in its entirety Western cultural practices. And so what you begin to see is a birth rate that is the lowest in the world. I think we were talking, my wife, that the birth rate in Korea now is the lowest in the world. And that's because young people want to have the kind of life and lifestyles of the West. And so they don't have time for a family. But of course, if the birth rate is that low, then fast forward 20, 30 years, there's no one left. And so now you see these other, top-down programs, incentives for increasing birth rate, prenatal care, postnatal care, completely paid for by the government in order to foster and get people to have more kids. You also see, because everything is controlled by Samsung, you have forced retirement to give a chance for other people, young people, to have a job, to have some kind of, means of making money to support a family so that they can have kids, and so you have this very weird system in the society because the economy is so controlled by the government. Now, they're paying in different ways, sure, but this prosperity that we're seeing has the risk of having an eventual steep decline in Korean culture and society. There's massive corruption, of course, embezzling happening left and right, corruption on the political level, in the media, and all that other kind of stuff. But there was just enough freedom for them to be able to enjoy a certain level of prosperity, at least for some part of the population. In terms of freedom of speech, things like that, a lot of people in Korea really didn't miss it because they never really had it, right? There was no tradition of freedom of speech. And so certain freedoms no one really missed. No one knew that they were missing at all. Perhaps the various financial crises, like the massive inflation that happened over several periods of recent Korean history since the Korean War, has led to a lot of distancing from America. And so my mom told me that there were American requests from the United States government to the Korean government to cut off all ties with China and Russia, which were ignored by Koreans, which is a good sign, right? And I think because of the distance away from America, because of the importance of the Korean Peninsula in terms of its relationship geographically with Russia and China, there's this sort of balance that the United States needs to maintain with Korea. And maybe that leads to an advantage for Korea and gives them a little bit of leverage. But in any case, at the end of it all, the major difference between Korea and Haiti is just a little bit of freedom, just a little bit of freedom for some of the people to enjoy a little bit was enough to create that explosion in the economy. So you kind of have to wonder what a lot of these African countries, what a lot of countries like Haiti could become if they were able to enjoy a little bit of freedom. Anyway, that's some passing thoughts on my part on the issue that it's not necessarily a racial or a cultural thing, right? Because once you start seeing cultural values and practices that are better than yours, then you abandon the destructive practices. You abandon practices which do not create value for your society. And so a lot of the so-called Black culture that some people are eager to point out and say, see, this is why things are the way they are. No, no, no. Those supposed cultural practices exist primarily because of foreign interference in the everyday life of those people. So remove all of that and let them flourish. And perhaps that's something that a lot of people here in the West do not want to see, which is why many people are comfortable with the continued oppression of these other countries. The BRICS may change a lot of that. So hold on to your seats. A big change seems to be coming. And that's it for today. I'll talk to you next time.